you all for having me here today. So as Frank said, my name is Jay Weimar. So I'm a PhD student at Johns Hopkins in Near Eastern Studies and Bible, whose research focuses on comparative studies between the Bible and pre-Islamic Arabia, specifically the Old Testament. And my research interest began in this because there's a dearth of comparative study on the relationship between ancient Israel and contemporary pre-Islamic Arabia. To this end, Lauren Monroe at Cornell University and myself were invited to co-author an article on this subject for the upcoming edited volume, The Religions Around the Old Testament, which provides a popular survey of religious thought and practice in the various regions of the ancient Near East, such as Mesopotamia, Ugarit, Hadi, Egypt, Philistia, etc. And it highlights the notable instances of similarities or differences that these different regions have with Israelite religion as found in the Bible. And while there have previously been scholarship surveying the religion of pre-Islamic Arabia, these have tended to focus on the later period, so like right immediately before the rise of Islam. By contrast, Lauren Monroe and I's article is intentionally limited to the first millennia BC so as to be contemporary with the Old Testament and use the best available data. Now, you may be wondering, why should biblicists care about Arabia? And furthermore, what applicability does this have to the church? Well, from just purely a scholarly standpoint, there is just an absolute abundance of cognate data that promises to help enlighten the various practices of the Old Testament. So there are at least 15,000 pre-Islamic Arabian inscriptions that have been discovered so far, and this number promises to increase over the next few decades, especially as Saudi Arabia becomes more invested in their archaeology and tourism industry. And in total, these pre-Islamic texts span from the 11th century BC, so that's like before David and Solomon, until the rise of Islam in the 6th century AD, with most of them coming from Yemen and being written on either stones or sticks. You can see some of those right on the slide. Detailed in these inscriptions are not only early records of the polytheistic religions there, but also in the later periods, you have instances of early local Jewish and even Christian groups. Especially interesting as well is you have an advent of a third monotheism in later times. It's neither Jewish nor Christian. It's Judaizing, but not Jewish, that worships a god they call Rahmanan, which appears to be adopted into Islam's Allah al-Rahman, Allah the Merciful. Anyway, as I've discussed, we don't go that far in our article, but I do want to bring it up just to highlight that this pre-Islamic material promises to be insightful not just for Muslim scholars, but also for Christians and Jews. And hence, I think this data provides a wonderful opportunity for Christian scholars to find a shared interest and opportunity to engage and foster relationships with Muslim academics. Now, beyond this as well, I'm also hopeful that integrating more Arabian data into the church's understanding of the Old Testament might help combat sort of a lingering Islamophobia that's in the American church. For instance, when I grew up in sort of a post-dispensational, post 9/11 dispensational church, frequently teachers would point to the Isaac and Ishmael stories and use that to say, well, Isaac is the Jews and Ishmael's the Muslims, and since they're with Ishmael, that means they're cantankerous and blah 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 blah. Now, of course, this is bad theology, but it still lingers today to some degree. And to this end, I think a focus on Arabian material, by contrast, might allow us to emphasize the commonalities rather than the differences that we have with these groups. And this can be especially the case, for instance, if we focus on Moses' sojourn in Midian, for instance, after he leaves Egypt for slaying the Egyptian man. His father-in-law Jethro worshipped Yahweh in the middle of Arabia, where Midian was, which is very fascinating and has led to a lot of origins of Yahwehism debates that I will not get into today. Anyway, so there is much we could cover regarding similarities of cultic practice between the Bible and pre-Islamic Arabia. However, for the purpose of staying within time today, I'm merely going to focus on the conceptions of deity within the first millennia BC. So to start, there appears to be a tradition of avoiding direct references and representations of deities in both the Bible and pre-Islamic Arabia. So in Exodus 3, when God reveals himself to Moses asks for his name, and then God says, I am who I am, and tells Moses that his name is Yahweh, which his ancestors are said not to have formerly known. Now, within pre-Islamic Arabia, a scholar named Christian Roban has noted that several deities have fairly generic names that might actually be fillers for their actual names and hint that their actual names were therefore taboo. For instance, you have one god who's named Wad, which in these languages means love. There's also which means uncle, and Alat, which means the goddess. And Roban also believes that this is tied into a prohibition, or not prohibition, a general reluctance in the archaeological record to represent deities in an anthropomorphic form. To this end, gods were generally represented by symbols and sometimes seemingly animals, albeit it's frequently difficult to tell when a deity is identified or merely associated with an animal. So I have, for instance, over here, some horns. This represents one god, Athar, and this represents another god called Almaka. And this is a snake that's used frequently with the god Wad. But you notice that it's not. Now, within the Bible, prohibitions of God, making images of God, are directly prohibited, such in Deuteronomy 4, where God prohibits making an image of him because the Hebrews saw nothing in the fire when God spoke at Horeb. Now, there is one stunning exception to this resistance to depict deities in Arabia, though. In Yemen, at the South Arabian temple of Aranyada at Nashan, Arbak and Anduin found two near identical pillars that contained a series of 5 horizontal registers of deities talking together. I put some of them here, but you see the deities are sitting next to each other. So on the top register here, there's actually a fascinating thing that goes on because scholars generally agree that this over here is a picture of El. And El in the Bible is identified with Yahweh. So the word Elohim is from El, and that's generally the correlation that's made. So in this image, you see that the god El is communicating with the high god Athar. And while El in the Bible is not emphasized as a father god usually, within South Arabia, he is. So you also have lower on this pillar, you have this right here, where there's an inscription somewhere else. The actual image is a lot more broken, so this is a nicer form of it. Where you have these goddesses down here that you can see with the horns are said to be deities, but these are labeled the Banat Ili, which means the daughters of El. Otherwise, too, there is a stick inscription, or there are a few stick inscriptions that mention something called the Ahalu Ili, which means the clan of El, and that it includes a number of gods amidst it. So, for instance, Wad, Athar Nashk, and this other goddess who we don't know who that is. Anyway, this treatment of El in South Arabia roughly corresponds to the presentation of El in Upper Mesopotamia and Ugarit, where he's represented as a father god who procreates, versus in the Bible, where you don't have God as a procreator usually, or at least not as a physical procreator. He's not displayed as that. So while in the Bible you have sort of El and Yahweh, they're identified as one God and the chief object of Israel's worship. By contrast, El within the South Arabian pantheon appears to play a minimal role, despite his higher rank, and is only mentioned a handful of times, and most of the times indirectly. More important over here is this high god, Athar, who is viewed as sort of like the high god instead. In fact, you have sort of an interesting parallel between these two deities in that El's name is the general word for God in Hebrew and in most Semitic languages. And so the word El or Il is God, and Elim or Elim is gods. In South Arabia, similarly, Athar, by comparison, becomes the general word for goddess. Take, for instance, this inscription, M283, where an individual makes a dedication to Athar Zu Kab, Wad, Nakrachum, Athar Zu Yaharik, and Athar Yaharik. And so, first off, notice that there's 3 mentions of this name. And 2 of these mentions are sort of a male manifestation of a deity. So you have different manifestations of the high god Athar, and this one is ranking lower. And then this third one is actually the wife of the preceding one. And there's actually a difference in formula. This one has a relative particle du, which is Athar, a name of this place, and this is a goddess. So this is just working as a goddess name. I won't get into the technical details any further, but there's a difference. And so we see that the word seems to become just a general word for goddess, how El's name is also just a general word for God. Now, aside from this, a sort of final point is that Daniel Fleming and Lauren Monroe, within the field of biblical studies, have especially also emphasized a role of defining deities via kinship that is found in both South Arabia and the Bible. So, for instance, in South Arabia, tribes would have certain patron deities with which they were affiliated and with which they were identified as a nation. So, to this end, you have frequently some the people being called the children, the wulad of that deity. A major text at this end is RES 3945, which I show over here, this inscription. That was in a temple at Sirwa. And it mentions Seba's army, which was identified with biblical Sheba, like the Queen of Sheba in 1 Kings 10. And they are called the children of Almaka, their patron deity. Now, aside from this, there's also the aforementioned name of the Katabonic god Am, which means uncle. We can compare this to the Hebrew phrase Am Yahweh, which is not the same word because Am in the Bible means people rather than uncle. But we do see in both cases that there is sort of a kinship affiliation between people and deity. So this brief overview, I hope, has whet your appetite for the potential that Arabia has to help illuminate the practice of biblical religion and the importance of its further study. Even though Hebrew and Arabic are cognate language, in general, there has not been a lot of connecting ground for Christians and Jews trying to learn more about religion and Muslims. To this end, I am hopeful that an expansion of interest in pre-Islamic Arabia by biblicists will help bridge this gap and provide opportunities to open up avenues of dialogue between those of us in church and those that are in the mosque. Thank you.
And Second Peter has a conclusion that includes the author's reflections on Paul's letters, as you may remember. Eugene Peterson translated it this way: some things Paul writes are difficult to understand. Irresponsible people twist them every way. Well, that's the 2,000-year history of Paul's letters and his memory, isn't it? Add to it arguments about which letters Paul wrote, which he might have written, and what we know he didn't write, but which bear his name. Add to that theories of interpolations, or the ideas that one or more letters contain multiple pieces of various letters. And then if we just take one key foundational idea at the heart of the Protestant Reformation, namely justification by faith, we have scholars with the so-called traditional perspective of Paul, TPP for short, arguing with those in the so-called new perspective on Paul, NPP for short. Which Paul are we talking about? That is the question through the centuries. And now I've written a book with the title, Paul Found in His Letters. One friend of mine asked me about the title. Shouldn't it be, he asked, Paul : found in his letters? A good question, but my answer was, the title is the argument. It is an argument that surfaces throughout the book because the Paul from his 7 letters is different, not always, but quite often, and sometimes quite contrary from Paul discerned in Acts of the Apostles and the pastoral epistles, as well as his memory into our time, as we know, like in churches that exclude women from leadership. I've made this argument from a historian's perspective, that if some fact, some story, some picture from the past can be authenticated and verified, then we might possibly actually have a fact. Can we, though, for example, prove that Paul was a citizen of the Roman Empire? He's been such ever since Acts was written. But where is the external proof? Where else is it confirmed? Pamela Eisenbaum has said that deciding that Paul was a citizen is an argument from silence, or as she puts it, and thus not well-founded. To be sure, arguments from silence must be used with great care. Well, with great care, they were 3 words that governed my research as I became what I call an independent Pauline scholar. I use that title, as it were, because I don't have the credentials that most of you in this association have. At the same time, my book does represent a debt of gratitude for the work of scholars that I read and met in my research days. And I felt called upon then, in the context that I wrote, to share the work of Pauline scholars from the past 75 years or so with a larger audience. This is kind of a history of Paul, but more accurately, pictures of Paul in his own words in the economic, social, political, and cultural world of the first century in the Roman Empire. In that context is what Benjamin White says, we discover the remembered Paul, which is really many different Pauls. To that end, we add the Paul who was attacked over and over in Acts by Jews, but then there's the Paul who aches for his brothers and sisters in Romans. Or is he the Paul who will not let women speak in church? Or is he the Paul who entrusts Phoebe with his longest letter? After my years of researching the arguments dividing scholars regarding justification by faith and how to translate Ac Pistis Christo, I came across the dissertation of George Lyon's A Pauline Autobiography, with its focus on 1 Thessalonians and Galatians. Then I wondered, what if we look at all 7 letters of Paul, the undisputed, and ask, what do we know about Paul and his story from his own words? Can we find him in the history of the first century? We can. First, we take a reference in 2 Corinthians 11 that he escaped from Damascus as the ethnarch of King Aretas IV was about to arrest him. He went down in a basket in the night. And then the same story, sort of, is told in Acts chapter 11, only this time the Jews were after him. 2 similar stories. And then we have Paul's reference in Galatians that an earlier 3-year period, he had gone to Arabia. This connects with your work, Jay. I have a chapter, Paul in Arabia. The dots get connected. Paul's story gets strangely connected to the murder of John the Baptist, John who publicly accused Herod Antipas of adultery because he'd married his brother's wife Herodias and divorced himself from the daughter of King Aretas IV. It is that king who in the year 36 destroys Herod's army and presumably takes control of Damascus, if only for a short time, somewhere in late 36 or early 37. And that, my friends, places Paul in history at a particular time and place. And it's the only date we can do that with. It's not even a firm date. Please understand, this is not another book about Paul's theology, at least not directly. Paul is seen in relationship to his conflicts, his friends, and his understanding of what it meant to be in communities connected to Jesus Messiah. In that regard, he did not know what a church was. He did not know himself as a Christian. His communities were making difficult choices about how to live a Jewish story in a pagan world. They were composed of few people of some privilege, and clearly more at the bottom of the economic ladder, either as slaves or artisans living for their daily bread. Thus, it is a theme of the book that Paul placed his life and story of Jesus Messiah alongside the least in his world. As Davina Lopez described the situation of Jews in regard to the Roman Empire, in the eyes of Rome, they were just one of the many defeated and incorporated peoples living inside the empire. I'll give you a quick overview of the chapters. Chapter 1 is an introduction. It has to do with issues of language. There were no Christians in Paul's world. There was no one who would call themselves a Gentile, as that term derived only from the way Judeans saw everyone else. Chapter 2 is Paul in Arabia, as I mentioned. Chapter 3 asks Paul, what does your name mean? For most of my ministry, I never even asked that question. It's the Latin word for small. Was he a small man? Or was he called Saul? And then in response to an apocalyptic experience of Jesus as Messiah, was it a case of metanomasia, that his name was changed? And that I reference George Agamben, The Time That Remains. Chapter 4, Paul's living God's story. In that chapter, I write, Paul would not understand our focus on individuals doing their own thing. Never would he sing with Simon and Garfunkel, I am a rock, I'm an island. As we learn, many of the letters have been composed with the help of his co-workers. Paul would be one of those people we meet every now and then who use the plural form we when talking about something personal. That is a favorite pronoun of Paul's, by the way. Paul had the mindset of Bishop Tutu, who brought us to understand the deeply spiritual sense of the Zulu word Ubuntu. Paul, following Bishop Tutu, would say, a person is a person through other persons. We need other human beings in order to be human, unquote. Chapter 5, Paul lost in the crowd. I look at the socioeconomic realities where we find Paul sharing his life with the most vulnerable and marginal. Chapter 6 begins with a quote of Magnus Zetterholm. I'm quite confident that Christianity will survive a completely Jewish Paul, just as it evidently supplies a completely Jewish Jesus. And I more often use the term Judean Paul. Paul and community. We find ourselves in chapter 7 in a network of communities sharing historical continuity. They were telling the story of Israel with a Judean perspective, and it includes Paul's biographical memory and his many, many friends. Paul found in letters heard, here I focus not only on composition of letters, but their delivery as oral documents to be performed and acted out as if Paul was there in their midst as they were delivered. Paul, an unmanly man, chapter 9, the title speaks for itself. What Paul understood about women was so unlike a typical Roman man. He was so open and accepting of women as his equals, his co-workers, he called them, and he did not tell women to be silent in worship. Chapter 10, Paul, slave of Christ. Prior to this research, I had never wrestled with the horrible reality of slavery and the slavocracy of that first century. Paul was willing to call himself a slave of Christ, took on a whole new reality for me. I also argue that Philemon was being asked to accept Onesimus as a brother and no longer as a slave. Chapter 11, Paul and the Troubled World. There are two parts to this chapter. One is a focus on all of Paul's troubles with problems coming out of Corinth, where I asked, was Paul a failed pastor? And then the second part regards Romans, which we actually there see less of Paul's own story, but we encounter a more political and prophetic Paul. Chapter 12, Paul the Mystic. Here I connect Paul to the 400-year Kabbalah tradition of mysticism, which continues to this day, and note all the ways in which he was a deeply spiritual man. Chapter 13, Paul's watch, is about his expectation for the parousia, but strangely, if he's waiting for the coming of Jesus, why is he planning to go to Spain? Why did he choose to go there? And why does that, in some strange way, tell us that he most likely was not a Roman citizen? Chapter 14. There I go on a limb, by the way. I may stir up something with that. I don't know. Far shorter than all the others is my last chapter, where I focus on the work of Lisa Boland's African-American Readings of Paul, Reception, Resistance, and Transformation. It is about the 400-year history of African Americans identifying with Paul. His voice powers to this day others who are subjugated and dismissed. At the end of my book, I also celebrate the power of the word church, not ever as a building, but always as a community of followers of Jesus Messiah. If you want more information, I have it at www.paulfound.org. That's the website I created. There you'll also see that I post reviews of books as I continue to do my research and have fun doing that. And I thank you for asking me to share this with you.